Okay everybody, and welcome back to the painting channel. This week is going to be a watercolour of the Crown Mines in Poldark in Cornwall, which is right deep in the heart of Poldark Country. So join me now, let's see what goes on. Let's roll that introduction. Catch you in a minute. Okay, welcome back everybody. As I said just now, it's all about the Crown Mines in Poldark in Cornwall. And I visited there a couple of years ago and did some plein air right on the side of the cliff. And it was really exciting and a little bit unnerving, but it was fantastic. I also had photographs taken that ended up in the local area's National Trust magazine. So that was quite interesting too. You would have had a different video this week. You would have meant to have had a lovely colored pencil of a house sparrow. Unfortunately, I messed up when it come to the filming, so it was so overexposed and totally unusable. Those who follow me on Instagram will know of the plight, and if you want to see the end result that should have been as a film, go on my Instagram feed and you can see the lovely little house sparrow on a post. So with that all said, lesson learned, I moved on and I decided with time constraints this week that I would do this lovely little watercolor for you. Okay, before we go any further, I just want to say a big thank you to all my subscribers, new and old. Thank you so much for your support. It's most welcome. And if you're watching this and you're not a subscriber, then subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, but at least you know you're supporting the channel, and that will be fantastic. And like it and click the bell icon. It tells you when I'm uploading new content, which at the moment is every Friday. Don't forget also my Monday night live stream every Monday night without fail. On top of that, if you want even more, take a trip over to my Patreon. Lots more on offer. Tiers that do not cost you very much to get involved with, but you know if you do get involved, not only do you get a lot more for your money, but you also know that you're helping support my channel and all my efforts in creating content for everybody, but mainly for my patrons. So take a look at that, and if you want to get involved, hey, you'd be so welcome to come on board. Thank you. Anyway, now let's get back on and let's see how we do with the Crown Mines in Poldark. Catch you all soon. Okay, for this drawing is quite an extensive one, and in the real video it actually took me over half an hour to do this sketch, but I felt that it was really worthwhile because there were so many elements, and when you're trying to depict something that actually exists in this manner and is so well known, then there are going to be a lot of people out there that can criticize if it doesn't look right, and hopefully the time taken really does work out in my favor. And I took a lot of trouble to make sure that all the key elements of this were in the right place. Certain things like rock crevices and shadows may well have altered from the actual photograph to the finished product, but I really did try to hone in on all the key features and render them as closely as my ability would allow. I think we've done quite well. I just love to create all these wonderful cliff faces, cliff textures, the crevices, the small caves and ravines, and there's just so much of it. But it really was a lot of fun to do, and it was worth taking the effort, I can assure you. And if you're not sure about it when you're doing this, don't forget I will put the reference photo on my Patreon for you to enjoy. You can download this happily, and you can use the reference photo to learn from, and see how you get on. But you can also use some form of method to transfer the image to your paper if you don't wish to go into all that complex drawing. Now here I used a simple cobalt blue, nothing more, but I was very deliberate in trying to leave white paper to depict the areas where the water or the white water that's hit the rocks and then it comes back out into the water and it drifts along the coastline. I really was trying very hard to leave that there. You could of course mask it out, but the thing about masking, it is not exactly the precise method that you wish, and if you use a small applicator such as a pen, you can damage the surface of the paper. So I chose to use a thicker brush and be very careful in the application of the blue. As I came down towards the foreground, I added a little bit of Cobalt turquoise, and what that does is it suggests all the oxygen that is in the water that has been created by the pounding against the rock surfaces. Here I put in some more blue, but I got a little bit of ultramarine mixed into that. It wasn't a problem. I took it back and added some more cobalt. Now I'm using a little bit of umber, a little bit of Indian red, and I put a little bit of Indian yellow into the top, as well as some more ultramarine in there to give me a bit of a green sense. I used a lot of Indian red, very pale, on the massive rocks to the right hand side, the cliff, and then I went in with quite a pale blue, a little bit of violet, a little bit of Indian red, a bit of blue in there, but making it really cold where all the rocks go out into the sea. Remember, all of that we are doing right now is simply putting an underlayer, the first layer, the first wash, blocking it all in so that once it's dry we can carry on and bring more colors and more detail into this painting. Once again, I've used a little bit of Indian yellow into this and suggested all the green grasses, dry grasses on the top parts or the upper parts of each of the cliffs, and some variations of the cool colors, a little bit darker here, a little bit darker there on the cliff faces. Now also note that I've actually put a lot of negative space in and around the rocks themselves where they meet the water. I've just left white areas and little fingerlets of dark coming into them, suggesting where the white water is pushing up against the rock. I then used a little bit of cobalt blue and Aureolin to give me a lovely green on the grassy plateaus where the crown mine sits all on its lonesome there. Here I used some ultramarine blue and started creating the distant and coming forward all the little areas of waves that are out in the sea, and I wanted a slight variation to the cobalt, so I went in with a bit of ultramarine. It wasn't as strong as a pure pigment, but it was enough to lift all those bits of blue and create that massive sea volume beyond the shoreline. And I also use it to come over some of the white areas and darken one or two, so it definitely supports that white and the way that the foam is drifting up and along the coast. It really is, that's one of the lovely parts about it, that you see all this white water drifting off. You can just imagine the power of the water as it's crashing in, constantly crashing against these cliffs. And bear in mind that as you do this, try and make all the marks that you create as random as possible. As human beings, we do have this innate ability to see patterns in everything, and sometimes the harder you try to avoid them, the more you create. But really do try and pay attention to making all these wave marks that you're putting in right now as random. Now, if you see here, as I was going along the cliffs the other way with the darks into the white, I'm now doing the same thing and using that space positively and putting bits of blue into the white there, creating that surge of color, change to the white and the foam, and they're beating up against the edges of the cliffs. I added some cobalt turquoise to the blue that I was using as we come ever so much closer to the foreground, and even almost pure at this point, just to finish off the lovely aerated water right at the bottom of the picture. Now I turn my attention to the rocks again, and I used an amalgam of different blues, blue greys, cobalts, ultramarines, Indian reds and raw sienna to depict all the subtle changes within the rocks themselves. A little bit of lichen on the top, giving it that yellowish hue, and I started to examine how much water and pigment ratios giving me darks and lights, and I used darks against lights, lights against darks. I was careful how much I used in some of the crevices. I didn't want them all black lines, I made them more subtle. Here I added some dark to depict the edges of the main cliff in the foreground. It just throws it out and gives it a much better edge to see. And again, I'm looking at all the subtle changes, all the little subtle nuances to make this particular piece of rock as real as I possibly can, adding bits while it's still damp, as well as waiting for other areas to dry out, increasing the darks in the shadows prominently where needed, where you've got this real heavy dark mass, and then it comes down into the darker fissures and all the other subtle little elements before I can move on to the rest of it. And now I'm just putting in the chimneys and the darker elements to the crown building itself. Don't forget, I've already put in the light wash to start with, so I'm just putting darker aspects in before I move on to the cliff. Now with this cliff, the furthest one away, I'm putting some really blue greys, just subtle changes, cool against the lovely warm values of the wash that I put in beginning. Before I move on to the big bulky cliff in the foreground, just putting in these subtle little changes and suggesting the crevices before we move on. Now for this big one in the foreground, much the same, little bit of greenish coming into the washes as I move down with the blues, and a little hint of the yellow in there, so give it a little bit of difference here. And then I've gone back in with a bit more magenta into that, a little bit of Indian red coming in there and making those blue greys a little warmer. But these are really just subtle differences to give variance to the rock faces overall. Now I'm putting that lovely blue grey shadow in the edge of the crown building, being very careful to work my way around those windows. I don't want to lose the light that is coming through there, and it's the darkness in the shadows that are giving me that lovely light sense. It throws the windows out and increases the light. That little bit of building in the front gets a similar treatment. The rock at the bottom, or the build at the bottom of the tower, has got a little bit darker because there is a substantial bit of footing there. Now I'm coming in with a bit of a bluish, dark blue color against the green that I've already put in, and that's suggesting the shadow from the building, and that really gives it presence. It really anchors it to the ground and gives that sense of 3 dimensions, which all cast shadows will do. And I've extended that into a really dark indigo and reddish Indian yellow mix into the cliff themselves, those real heavy darks into those really deep crevices and ravines. I've made them subtle change as they come up into the greenery areas of the cliff. That's why that green and cobalt and Indian yellow went in. I've put a bit of transparent orange in there as well, just increasing some of the variance of colors in the top end of that cliff, making them a little bit warmer, a little bit heavier, as they are sort of, obviously it's that much closer, so I wanted to suggest that there's a bit more aerial perspective. Now I'm starting to work on bits and pieces of the detail in the building itself, bringing out the windows and the details within the windows as I can, but leaving the subtle little bits of light that throw them out before I come back in to start looking at all the cliff faces, all the subtle changes. Very, very light to begin with. I can increase these. If I go in too heavy, I can't take it off. I'm using once again that negative space where the water is lapping up against the rocks by increasing little bits of darks here and there where the rocks are either wet or just in shadow. But all the way along I'm making little strides forward before I come back in with heavier marks and suggest that where there is more shadow, where maybe the fissures are deeper and the recesses are deeper, and therefore little light is coming out and they just appear much, much darker. But the whole thing was a build process. You can see multiple layers of color underneath this and making it all work. So hopefully you can see the process of build, and this is why the original painting is over 2 hours long. It just took a long time to sit and study and work out all those subtle bits and pieces. I could have done it quickly if I'd have wanted to, but I would have had much less accuracy in what I was depicting. And as I said, this is an iconic area. Lots of people know it, and there are huge amounts of photographs almost from the very spot that I must have stood depicting it. So it will be quite obvious if I've done a faithful job or not, and trying to understand all the subtle changes within the rock. It really was important to me to make sure that I'd done as good a job as I possibly could. I took a long time to study the reference photo and then checked all the information that I'd done in the painting. So this last part really was just adding all the I's and crossing the T's, just to make sure that it was as close to the thing as I possibly could make it. I checked how deep some of the darks needed to be, even adding one or two little light areas here and there around the bottom of the building, and a little shadow that went on the side of the building there. Added some darks into the greens and varied those bits of grass going up past the building before finally finishing off. Now, I've enjoyed this painting. It's been a lot of fun, although it has been pretty much a marathon. And if you're watching it on Patreon, as I say, you're going to get the full 2¼ hours. I added a little bit more dark to the crown mine. I felt that it needed to go down a little bit more. But hey, it's all done and we're there. I really have enjoyed it, as I said. I hope you've got something from it. I hope you're going to have a go at this one yourself. Don't forget the references on my Patreon. Enjoy. Catch you all soon.